Okay, welcome everybody to today's Center for Robotics and Biosystems seminar, our first of the new quarter. I'm very pleased to have Wendy Murray here to speak about her work on biomechanical modeling. Extremely relevant for us since we just got this new research center on trying to build robot hands. Wendy is our expert on real human hands, so please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks very much, Kevin, and thanks for the invitation. I'm excited to be here. I always feel like whenever I go to a robotics conference that there's such overlap. You know, we think about the same things in very different ways. So I'm interested, especially with the new center, to figure out if there's opportunities for synergy or to learn from each other. A few years ago, started putting together, I don't know what motivated me to do this, but it's a timeline. I have this sort of unique role in my career. I was at the birth of the upper limb model. I have been working on it since it was conceptualized. I was a PhD student here at Northwestern. Ed Colgate was on my master's thesis. I took ME 390. I was a math major, and it was really my first mechanical engineering real class. So it went well for me, I guess. But so I was here at Northwestern, and my project was to build an elbow model. And what I hope that this timeline shows is that there must be something useful about biomechanical modeling, because it's really formed basically the backbone of my work through my whole career. But it also points to the fact that there's been a lot of change in our world of how we study human motion, the types of computational things that we can do, and the tools that we use to model human motion. And there's just kind of always moving forward and adding complexity. We have just recently completed a biomechanical model of the hand, and I'm kind of generous about the word completed. We put out this publication to say this is what we have, and there's no way to make advances further unless other people can contribute as well. So along the way, all of these models have been open source, and the field has given us feedback that they find them valuable. So my modeling efforts, like I said, this is where I started with biomechanical modeling of the upper limb, was a set of bones that didn't even have the kinematic representation relative to each other. And where we are now is we have the capacity to use models of the hand to solve for what sorts of activation patterns the nervous system might use to create complex hand motions. So I thought I'd start a little bit today with just the idea of for biomechanical modeling in general, what does building a biomechanical model entail? And everybody's used to the idea that sometimes when you're building something, you need a little instructions sheet, which sometimes is helpful and sometimes is not. So we're not building Billy, but we're trying to build from all of its component parts, a biomechanical model that can tell us something about how we move and control our arms and hands. So in that instruction sheet in biomechanics, people who build biomechanical models, there are sort of these step-by-step processes. And in general, and where I started was to define the joint kinematics. And I'm going to give examples with the elbow since it's a much simpler system. It's where I started. It'll be easier to explain. But a difference between robotics and biomechanics is that the rigid bodies we're working with are generally very oddly shaped. So here's an example of the type of data that we use to start defining the kinematics of human joints, that there's a lot of detailed anatomical work. So again, people have done this kind of work in cadavers. People have done this kind of work in using imaging like that. Our ability to quantify the shape and other components of bones is changing all of the time. But the idea here is human bones and human body segments involve shapes that are not, you can't just model orthogonal coordinate systems and your axes of rotation. We work hard to try to define them in a way that they reflect how the bones move in real life. And that often involves axes that are oriented, skewed from an orthogonal reference frame. Once you have the bones assembled and put together, the next task is to define the muscle tendon paths. And we do this, and one of the ways that we validate them is to think about what muscle moment arms are. So moment arms in biomechanics means the same thing as moment arms in any sort of mechanical engineering system. It's the transformation between the force a muscle can generate and the torque it produces about a joint. So muscles are linear actuators. And in addition to that transformation, we're interested in the transformation between muscle tendon length change and joint angular excursion. And that is what we use muscle moment arms to evaluate how well our models are doing in that respect. So again, one of the great things about studying the musculoskeletal system is most people have some connection to it and understand that musculoskeletal anatomy is complex. Here's an anatomical illustration of two muscles that are both elbow flexors, the biceps and the pronator teres. So what we try to capture when we build biomechanical models is how they attach, how the muscles attach to the skeleton, and how when the skeleton moves, the mechanical advantage of the muscle changes. So we usually do this with a series of points and line segments where we try to capture the origin and insertion, the actual skeletal attachments. We often have to introduce geometry structures to capture the wrapping over the bones. And then our goal is to see, can we capture the difference in moment arms between muscles, and then how changing the joint posture changes the mechanical advantage of the muscle. So for any joint that we've modeled, we would be looking at, given how we've chosen to attach the muscle tendon unit to the skeleton, given the joint kinematics we've represented, and these shapes, there's a lot of art into defining these muscle tendon paths. Have we captured that the biceps is a supinator, so it helps us rotate this way, and the pronator teres, right in its name, is a pronator, in addition to the fact that the biceps is a more effective elbow flexor than the pronator teres. And then we see that there is these range of elbow flexion, elbow extension moment arms, and basically many muscles have more than 1 degree of freedom. So we try to capture that information by doing experimental work. This is work from my master's thesis and a PhD. And we did that work in cadavers. Increasingly, we're trying to get this type of data from medical imaging. But in general, what is the function, the mechanical function of muscles in terms of when they generate a force, how effective are they at causing a joint rotation? And then just keep in mind, another thing that happens is that as a muscle is effective at causing joint torque, it's going to go through a greater length change than muscles with smaller moment arms.
Sorry, is this for a particular configuration of the arm?
This would be, I think, 90 degrees elbow flexion. Yes.
And since the biceps crosses the shoulder, does it depend on the shoulder also?
There is a shoulder moment arm, and the integration between how much changing the shoulder and affects the biceps as well is not as well studied. I don't think we have a connection in the model at this point. Biceps, elbow flexion moment arms do depend on forearm supination. I'd like to say that one of the reasons it's easier to do pull-ups in this position than this position is because you have a bigger moment arm for the biceps when your forearm is supinated. So we've put the bones together, we put muscles on, and we validated that within some respects, we're capturing differences in the way when a muscle generates force, it causes a joint to rotate. The next step is to define how much force each muscle can generate, and we do that because there is a structure function relationship between in muscle, which is referred to as muscle architecture. So just sort of an illustration here, our muscles have various shapes and sizes, and so we can measure things about the muscle and link those parameters to muscle models so that we can map detailed measurements like cross-sectional area and length of muscle fibers to predict how much force a muscle can generate and over what range of lengths that muscle can generate that force. Again, thinking back to the moment arm, you have a linear force actuator that's attached to the skeleton. In addition to the moment arm transforming between the force the muscle produces and the torque it can produce, there is a relationship between the length of the muscle and how much force it can produce. So understanding how long the muscle's fibers are and how much length change it goes through affects the muscle's ability to generate force in different portions of your range of motion. So this is also work from my PhD thesis that is just intended to say when you study muscles, from my PhD, we looked at from a very small woman to a very large man, how different components of muscle structure were. So we have here a length measure and here a cross-sectional area. So again, this would scale with force and this would scale with about how much length change the muscle could go through and generate force effectively. So we see the two muscles we were looking at before, the biceps and the pronator teres. They live in different spaces, even among different people. We do have a musculoskeletal design to our system. And so some of the work that we've done to put together these models is to understand how different muscles live in these different sort of force excursion spaces, tied to also their geometry on the skeleton, to understand some details about what the potential for force actuation or what the capability to generate force is when we put them in our model.
I guess I'm not fully following the meaning of the sort of relevance of the fascicle length here. Could you go back?
Yeah, so from ME 390, mechanical elements that connect in series have lengths that add, and muscle fiber lengths are composed at its smallest functional unit. There's a component called the sarcomere. So the force length properties of muscles sort of live in the sarcomere. And the brachioradialis has maybe 50,000 sarcomeres in series, and the pronator teres has maybe 3 times less than that in series. So if you think of a muscle optimal fascicle length as how many sarcomeres in series that muscle has, you're going to scale the basic force length generating properties of the sarcomere up to this muscle can generate force over a much longer, over 3 times more excursion than this muscle. And that gets paired with the fact that this muscle is positioned further away from the axis of rotation. So when you go through the full range of elbow motion, it uses more length.
Okay. One follow-up question. Also, as you add these springs, and the elasticity of the sarcomere factors in it, so you would expect the longer muscle to be more elastic, more compliant. And is that?
Yeah, there's definitely a compliance issue, but the thing to think about also is that the sarcomere is an active force generator, and so there is an active control of that, and so things like stiffness vary with the amount of activation the muscle is generating. So we've put the bones together, we've put muscles on it, we've done our best to try to replicate the linear to rotational transformation, both in terms of force and excursion. We've defined some parameters that tell us that the biceps generates bigger forces than the pronator teres based on the structure of the muscle. And then kind of the next step to validating a model, a simple model like the elbow, is to say how strong are humans and how strong is our model. And so we do this sort of theoretically by just saying, if you turned on all the elbow flexors, what does the model say about how strong of an elbow flexion torque all the elbow flexors could generate? How strong does the model say all the elbow extensors are? And then you compare that to similar measurements that you would take, that there's data in the literature, or you could take them yourselves. So you put everything together, you have a strength of your model, you've compared it, you've made parameter choices that in some respect reflect the general strength of the population. And then oftentimes we would stop there, but now as we've moved into the desire for dynamic simulation, we also then add parameters and constraints needed to implementation of for dynamic simulations. So things like the mass and the inertia of the segments, we need to represent end constraints representing the ends of the range of motion, which you could think of as like hard stops between your bones. Ligaments, our ligaments serve as a ligaments and soft tissue serve as a sort of joint limit enforcement. So implementing all of that. And so for the elbow model, this is just the performance of the elbow model. If you just dropped it against gravity and saw its passive dynamic behavior, we were here comparing performance of two different muscle models implemented in two different software systems, just to say, one would think, often people say, oh, you're using the OpenSim model or using the SIM model. One would think all of these parameters should behave the same, whether you take all the parameters and put them in MATLAB, take all the parameters or use different, that there's something we're capturing about the biomechanical system. And that's all we were showing here. So in general, these kinds of tools are widely adopted in my field. Our whole upper extremity dynamic model, which was published in 2015, has been provided open source and it's been downloaded. It's comforting to see close to 10,000 times. We do get feedback about it not working, but we definitely haven't gotten 10,000 complaints. So that basically, there is a big field that uses these tools. And so our hope is that they're helpful.
This is called SimTK now.
SimTK, yes, yeah.
Question. Based on the illustrations, are your dynamic models kind of simulating multiple, basically masculine models acting independently?
Yes, yes. So in our representations, what we've tried to capture is for every muscle in the model that the moment arms replicate what we know from human studies, that the muscle architecture parameters replicate, and then we think about that muscle acting in isolation.
I guess the follow-up question kind of linked to ask question before. So how can you correlate, like at what level do you correlate experimental measurements from the elasticity of the muscle as the simulation input to this number of fibers? Because I guess like this is the reduced order of parameters compared to the actual number of elements.
So there's a
Excuse me, can you repeat the question?
Okay. Yeah, the question is about how do we go from the fact that muscle is composed of many fibers and we represent each muscle by one sort of lump parameter model.
Any empirical correlation between the two?
And what is the empirical correlation? There is a theoretical muscle model that tells us how to go from sort of macroscopic structure to predictions of how much force a muscle can generate. And some of that work has been done in animals, and then there's been a theoretical muscle model. There's a series of muscle models that allow us to scale from parameters we actually measure either from imaging or from cadavers that allow us to have a lumped parameter model that represents the behavior of all of the systems acting together. Does that address your question?
Yeah, I guess I need to read up on the specific model. Yeah.
Yes.
Quick question. So years ago, when we were doing functional electrical stimulation of the arm, we tried using a model like this, but there are so many parameters to fit to any particular subject that we sort of gave up. So I'm wondering what the applications are. So if you were going to try to apply this to understand a particular subject, you'd have to gather lots and lots of parameters. So there are a lot of parameters, is what I'm saying. So what would you use this for? Like, what are the applications? I mean, this is showing what one set of parameters could do, and you can do simulations, but then how do you apply it for what kinds of problems? Yeah.
So in general, one of the utility of biomechanical models is that we can measure motion well, but we cannot measure what the muscles are doing. And so one component of modeling is to say, for example, this is a generic model. It's been aimed at the 50th percentile male. A lot of the data I collected about different people of different sizes was to see, could we scale those models up and down? But one thing you might use is just general principles. You cannot, when studying motion, know what individual muscles are doing. There's no way to directly measure that. You can measure things like the electrical activity of the muscles during motion. And you can make some assumptions about what that means, but there's no way to instrument all of the muscles in the human body and figure out how they're contributing to emotion. So one way that we use these models is to capture motion using motion capture techniques and solve optimization problems and figure out what the best muscles are to turn on to create that motion, and then try to study what sort of principles the nervous system might be using to plan a motion. People do scale these models up and down. There's people that try to study how well that works. We in my lab do imaging studies where we try to understand if someone's had a stroke or a spinal cord injury, or they've had an orthopedic surgery, how is the muscle adapted from kind of the standard parameters of a muscle? And if we incorporated that, how would that change the way someone moves? In my lab, we do surgical simulations. Orthopedic surgery is a lot geometric change. So you might move the attachment site of a muscle from one point to another because you've torn a tendon or you have a spinal cord injury and you need to reconnect your ability to control movement by moving a muscle insertion. People are trying to use these types of models to gain control strategies for exoskeletons. We recently used it to study the pitching motion because it's a very dangerous motion. Just the motion itself sort of tears the elbow apart, and trying to understand what the role of muscles are in stabilizing the elbow joint and what might be something that we could discriminate someone who is at risk for an elbow injury versus someone who is not. And in that case, what we did is we did simulations where no muscle contribution was there, where the 50th percentile muscle contribution was there. And then we said, I bet pitchers are stronger than the 50th percentile male. Let's double the strength of the elbow flexors and see how that affects the load on the ligament that gets damaged during pitching. So there's ways you can use this kind of intelligently to understand better things that we can't measure and we can't do experiments for. And we often sort of use it in a sort of cyclical realm where we try to understand the biomechanics of the system, maybe design an experiment to ask a question, get some feedback that says there's something that we didn't expect. How does that incorporate to things we had in the model? But I'll come back to this at the end because there is this desire to use it in the way that you're talking about, and it is a challenge. And I'll talk about some things that we're doing in the lab now. All of this was a brief intro into what it takes to build a model. And I use the elbow because the elbow is like such an elegantly simple system. But we use our hands, and we use our hands in particular in ways that are sort of overwhelming to think about how to model. And I also tend to think that our hands and arms are really personal parts of our musculoskeletal system. We use our hands to talk to each other. We use our hands to take care of each other. We use our hands to take care of ourselves in addition to the sort of feats of strength we get to see every 4 years at the Olympics. Every part of the hand is more complex than the elbow. I talked about those joint kinematic axes. There's multiple bones in the wrist and multiple bones in the hand, and they are oddly shaped, and the axes of rotation are not orthogonal. Often we're dealing with systems that have multiple degrees of freedom where we have non-orthogonal axes that are non-intersecting. So the kinematics is challenging. The musculoskeletal anatomy is also challenging. It's just kind of overwhelming to think about all of the different linear actuators and how they're attached to the skeleton. They're also harder to study because they're smaller and there's much less data available to add into these models. So hopefully that gives you some insight as to why it's taken us so long to get here. I came back as faculty in 2007, and really a fundamental thing driving my lab was to try to get this model made. And we attacked it. I used to be a distance runner. I ran a couple marathons. We attacked it 1 mile at a time. And so all these little icons here represent sort of incremental steps we made, incremental publications addressing, some piece of the model that at some point a postdoc then came and assembled everything and got it to the state that it was. So a lot of my applications, I'm like, not in terms of, my applications are, could this model be useful for understanding something clinically? And some of that comes from a biomedical engineering degree, but some of that also comes from the fact that after I left Northwestern, I first went to the Case Western Reserve and worked in the Cleveland FES Center. And I worked with folks that were trying to figure out how to use electrical stimulation to restore hand function to people with spinal cord injury. And then from there, I worked as a research investigator and independent PI in the VA in Palo Alto, and I was tackling similar problems in that there is a whole realm of surgical reconstruction after spinal cord injury where they reconnect muscles that are not affected by the injury to your hand so people can do simple hand opening and closing tasks through orthopedic reconstruction. So the idea that a biomechanical model would be useful for applications, one of the areas I was interested in was clinical applications. And again, I was really motivated by the spinal cord injured population. So this is video from a patient I worked with when I was at Case. And this, as a part of the FES systems, they also do these tendon transfers. Again, this is, you have some muscles that are usually more proximal, closer to your torso, that are not affected by the spinal cord injury, and they try to reconnect them to muscles that are paralyzed in your hand. So this video is someone who got an FES system implanted, but what I'm going to show you is just the result from a tendon transfer that restored wrist extension. So this is before a tendon transfer, and you can see he is unable to pick up a simple block and put it into the box. This is his performance after he has had wrist extension, just wrist extension. He is manually controlling a muscle that extends the wrist. And this is his improvement in function in his ability to pick up the block and move it. So what I learned from working with surgeons who do these reconstructions is that there is a lot of function that can be restored in the hand if you have the passive behavior of the hand sort of sculpted and controlled. And in particular,
Sorry, is that the same person? Sid?
yes, it's the same.
And did they have an injury or what?
They had a spinal cord injury at the about the C6 level, so a cervical spinal cord injury. They have lost all ability to control their wrist and hand. They were getting an implant where they would have electrical stimulation that would allow them to control.
Yep.
And what they needed was additional wrist strength, voluntary wrist strength. So they had a tendon transfer to provide them the ability to voluntarily control their
Okay,
wrist.
so FES and a tendon transfer.
Yes, but this is just of the tendon transfer.
Oh.
This is only the wrist extension has been restored. This is without the FES.
So out of curiosity, how did you clinically arrive at the conclusion that what was needed was control of the wrist? I mean, it wasn't at all clear to me looking at that first video how I would have gone about helping the person.
So that comes from decades of the FES Center's experience. And one of the things that is clear is that if you restore the ability to actively close your hand, because of the anatomy, all of those tendons cross the wrist. And so you would drive yourself into wrist extension. So even if you are restoring the ability to actively close your hand, if you don't have a muscle that can balance the wrist, your function is not going to be as useful. And so I think that was experiential as well as kind of when you step back and think about the biomechanics, it makes sense. And that's sort of illustrated here. This grip that we're talking about restoring is sort of a basic passive grip. It's referred to as tenodesis. If we all just let our hands rest against gravity, our fingers would be open. If you even passively just moved your wrist, your fingers would be closed. And again, that goes to this complex anatomy. Many of the muscles that power the fingers have muscle bellies that are in the forearm. They cross the wrist. And so there's this deep connection between your ability to move your fingers and the wrist. And again, when you're dealing with a spinal cord patient who has lost all ability, that passive tenodesis, without it, you could see that you can't really control opening or closing your hand. But if you can just restore wrist extension, you might be able to pick up a fork by yourself. You might be able to use a key by yourself. And so even without FES, these tendon transfers are part of a clinical strategy. So embedded in when I started here and what we were thinking about doing about moving the hand forward, it was always important to me that this tenodesis behavior was embedded in our hand. And there was actually data, this is data from the Case group, because this part of hand function is so important for restoring hand function in spinal cord injury, where they measured the torques about the MP joint, so your major finger, your major joints at your knuckles. And they did it in different wrist postures. So this is just passive joint properties of the MP joint, of the index finger, when you have your wrist flexed and when you have your wrist extended. And so having data like that really helps the biomechanical modeling. But even though that data was taken in 2000, we didn't have a model that incorporated sort of everything we needed. This was just a kinematic model until 2005. In my lab, we had people add sort of the mass and inertia properties to the model. We had studies done where we use CT to study sort of the degrees of freedom in the hand, so we could incorporate movement of the other fingers. And then another student in the lab, this is Ben Bender-Markey's work, he kind of put together this, he focused on the index finger, but we have this data from CASE. We have this data from CASE. We have now sort of biomechanical simulation ability for the hand, and we're adding in these properties. And so this is just an illustration. Again, we're only focusing on the index finger here. All we're doing here is computing the equilibrium position of the index finger, all three joints of the index finger. These are being determined by the forces in our muscle models. So we've sort of illustrated here, we have these extrinsic muscles that cross the wrist and across all three joints of the fingers. And we're putting the wrist in different postures. And we're showing that the equilibrium position of all three joints of the index fingers changes as we change the position of the wrist. And then we just have an illustration here of,
That's without gravity, I guess.
this includes gravity.
So is gravity pointing down on the page here? On the screen?
Yes, gravity is pointing down on the page. So here's an illustration of this, and this is a forward dynamic simulation. None of the muscles are on. The forces that are being generated have to do with how long the muscles are in the model. And there is, without activation, there is a passive force length curve in muscles. And so as you extend the length of a muscle tendon complex, you get bigger forces. Think about why we can't touch our toes as we age. That's what's happening. And so we have here, in contrast, a forward dynamic simulation where the initial position is as shown. There's no active forces. Gravity is going to move the hand. And this is with no muscle contribution. And again, we're only thinking about the index finger. So you can see that there is just a different behavior of the index finger with and without the passive muscle actions. And again, part of the reason I'm talking about this is just that we want sort of that instruction list of how to build a biomechanical model. And this sort of thing wasn't directly on it, but it was something that I learned from working with the clinical population and understanding that the hand is really sort of a different system. It's much smaller. Masses and inertias are ridiculously small, and these passive forces are really important, especially if you're thinking about clinical applications, where part of what goes wrong is people can't use their hands, and some of these passive forces might even become larger. So hopefully that also gives you an introduction to why we wouldn't just want to study the hand separate from the rest of the upper limb. We need the wrist connected to it. And in general, we're not the only people working on building biomechanical models or trying to use biomechanical models to learn something about how the system works. But again, the hand is such a complex system, and it's not like the lower extremity and steadying gait. There's not sort of a primary mode that you use your hand. So existing models are usually built around some question that a specific lab is asking. And so, like in our group, but this is actually work from our group, a lot of people use biomechanical models of the hand to try to provide input into hand dysfunction. So for example, this is a study from our group where we were studying the design of the wrist joint. So the hand is not just hard to model, but we think about artificial joints as some hips and knees as some of the most successful biomedical devices ever invented. There isn't really a successful wrist replacement If you need your wrist replaced because you have such severe osteoarthritis and you get a wrist replacement, you will be told you can't pick up more than 5 pounds with your hand for the rest of your life. And so often orthopedic surgeons will just remove the parts of the wrist that are painful, and that succeeds in reducing pain, but we've completely changed the kinematic design of the wrist. So again, we use the model to sort of understand these geometric implications for how your hand might be able to generate force afterwards. There's also lots of questions about how neural impairment associated with injury influences your ability to use the hand. This is from the same student in collaboration with Jules DeWald. We were studying paralysis of the intrinsic muscles of the hand. So there's muscles like I talked to you about, the extrinsic muscles that sort of, their muscle bellies are in the forearm and their tendons cross the wrist. There are also muscles that just live in the hand. When those muscles are paralyzed, we can't coordinate the extension of our hand. And so we've used it to study things like this. And then people use models to understand risk factors that arise. But it's hard to imagine doing that without a wrist. It's very rare that people are implementing simulation for complex functional tasks that require coordinated effort from all 5 digits of the hand. The group from CASE that I worked with was really sort of leading the field. And again, I think it's because of this implementation of FES and the desire to restore complex hand motion. But in general, people like Francisco Valero Cuevas have been working in this area for a long time, but we tend to study things as kinematics and force production of a single digit, somewhat isolated from the rest of the upper limb. And even the work we've done early on was just of the index finger. Most people that did things like study grasping tend to use their models for inverse dynamics, which is we might have some forces and some understanding of what position the hand is in, and then we back calculate what all the torques are that must have taken to create that force, and then do an optimization problem to understand which muscles contributed. What we wanted to do, in addition, that we wanted to add, and this is the postdoc, Daniel McFarland, who kind of took all these individual steps we had taken to this point and put it together, was could we do forward simulations? That is, we come up with activations that go into the model and we predict how strong the hand is. And so what we were trying to do was replicate what people do in the clinic when they measure grip strength. This is a picture of somebody holding what's called a clinical dynamometer. This is a clinical instrument that people use all over to understand how strong your hand is. Grip force is just having you hold this dynamometer, telling you to keep your arm and hand and wrist in a specific posture and to generate the largest force that you can with your hand and recording it. So we tried to replicate the geometry of that. We used an elliptical cylinder that was measured to sort of replicate the standard setting for measuring grip force. We had the device itself having 0 kilogram mass, because when we talk to clinicians, they actually hold the device. So we're just focusing on how much force the hand could generate. To calculate force, we used an elastic foundation contact model between the model of the dynamometer and the model of our fingers. These sort of green cylinders overlaying it were how we defined those contact pieces. We assumed that the proximal and intermediate phalanges were what came in contact with the cylinder, and we took the normal component at the cylinder's surface to be the grip force, sort of illustrating here. So this arrow illustrates our simulation of grip force.
Do you have a model of friction?
I think we do have friction in there. I can't, it's in the paper, but it was kind of a detail that I don't have
How
off the
does
top
that
of my head.
impact this brute force?
I think it's needed for the elastic contact foundation model. There is definitely a friction between the surfaces for sure.
Yeah, I can't imagine how it wouldn't, but
So you're squeezing, so most of the forces are probably normal, but
when you're wrapping your hand around
Yeah.
something curved and you're pulling in a single direction, so I think there's got to be shear forces and
We don't,
Forces.
we haven't with this, you could do all this sort of modeling with a more finite element modeling approach and doing that sort of contact. I think the elastic contact foundation is sort of a step towards that. But there are some basic parameters, that allow
So
us.
the elastic contact is sort of like a bristle of
Yeah,
springs. that-
Yeah,
oh,
how to,
Yeah,
you can't generate the force unless they're in contact, and then once it's in
Yeah,
contact.
So if I'm squeezing something with high friction versus low friction, you think I can get a stronger?
well, I don't know, but I think
Grip
it would,
force.
I would imagine it would impact.
Friction definitely impacts your ability to, impart force and,
Obviously, it's very important.
Yeah,
if you're
yeah,
looking
yeah,
at Things like that, but
Yeah.
but in this setting,
whether it's that critical for this
yeah,
outcome,
this
I
particular one
don't, I
may
don't
not be that
know.
critical, I just was curious.
But we did have to define a parameter. for it,
I
for
guess in
sure.
general, it just seems to me that there are probably really big frictional forces as you wrap around and that impacts the static equilibrium of all the
Yeah,
bones.
yeah, and whether we're representing that well, I think this area, contact forces is something that is something that
Yeah.
you guys do that perhaps we could learn from. We used optimal control. Again, we said we want to do this forward. We used optimal control and said, generate the biggest grip force you can, to decide which muscles to activate. We had this powered by 15 independent muscles in the model. The number of muscles was constrained. We have 43 muscles in our current biomechanical model of the hand, which
So,
is just,
so sorry, just grip force, that's a one-dimensional thing though?
yes,
It's one number.
yes, it's the normal
It's-
force.
It's that
That's-
angular grasp
Spring-loaded
grabbing,
thing,
spring-loaded
yeah, that's
thing.
how
Yeah,
far you-
so they measure this and they get a number.
Yep, yep.
So we constrain the muscles to those that would contribute to grip force. We looked at a constant activation level and we used simulated annealing, and implemented it, in MATLAB linked to the OpenSim API. We did not constrain wrist posture. Again, something that we're trying to do and add is this connection of the hand to the wrist. But we did encourage maintenance of an initial wrist posture with a function that penalized wrist movement. If you went into the clinic and had grip force, they would be doing this as well. They would say, keep your wrist in this position. We want to get a good measurement of your grip force in this wrist posture. So how strong was our model? It did well relative to clinical measures in the literature. So this is a study from the Mayo Clinic, and these are 5 optimal control solutions from our model. This is intended to show you that the blue bar is clinical measurements, and when they measured what wrist position they were on, they were slightly extended and slightly ulnarly deviated. And that is the simulated position we tried to use when we were generating grip force, and we were able to maintain that wrist posture while we were generating this grip force. This is important because there is data in the literature that shows how strong your hands are, depends on what wrist posture you're in. So this is the data from the Mayo Clinic, and they saw that there was the self-selected sort of optimum posture, this extended and slightly ulnar deviated, and when they forced them into different postures, that their grip force reduced drastically. We did not see the same drastic reduction, but we did see some dependence of grip force versus wrist posture. So again, where we are with this model is we are getting these simulations to work for the first time, and we're understanding what our model does well and what our model doesn't do well. And we're hoping that by making it open source, that we can have sort of the whole world contributing to improving it, as well as advances we'll make next. The other thing that this model did well, I think it goes with you, grip force is one measure. We looked at how the force that we generated for the grip force was distributed across the fingers. And so we saw sort of a simulation of which finger was responsible for most of the grip force, replicated very well. What I'm showing over here is just that, again, in addition to how hard it is to model the hand there, it's really hard to study experimentally as well. And so when we were assembling the data to figure out how to validate the model, we never got studies that did everything that we needed. So the study that determined how force was distributed across the fingers used a different wrist posture when they were measuring grip force, and we just sort of took all of that into consideration. And then there are some studies where they also took either surface or intramuscular electrical measurements of what activities the muscles were generating when people are doing grip force. And we had different results in what our optimal control simulation chose versus what has been measured experimentally. But this is kind of where we are with the simulations and trying to understand what the model does well, what insights it's giving us, how to use this to combine with experimental measures to better understand what muscles are contributing to motions and force development in the human system. So in general, where we are is that we have the capability to get a lot of different simulations running that use all 5 fingers and the thumb and is linked to the wrist and could potentially also be linked to the shoulder and elbow. We can do the optimal control forward simulation of grip force that I just described. We've also done static optimization solutions. For hand opening, this is the simulation of the passive. So all we're doing is sort of just moving the wrist position relative to gravity, the passive coupling between the hand and the wrist. And we've done similar types of assessments of how much pinch force can be generated. So as Kevin asked earlier, how do you use these for sort of implementation? I think similar to the FES questions that you are interested in, there's a lot of interest in general in rehabilitation. Could models be helpful for control of rehabilitation devices like exoskeletons? This work is part of what really drove the development of the biomechanical model. I collaborated with Richard Weir for a long time. We got funding in 2 separate sections. That the idea was, his vision was, is there a way that a real-time biomechanical model of the hand could be used to interpret user intent for the control of complex multifunction prosthetic hands? So in general, the development of complex prosthetic hands has advanced much more quickly than the appropriate control strategies. And this idea of using biomechanical modeling as a way to interpret user intent is not just for biomechanical or prosthetic hands, but for many different things, and not just in the upper limb. I've been collaborating with Lee Miller for a few years now, and we've gotten a recent grant where we're trying to use, kind of in a similar way, use the model to help interpret to provide a virtual hand so that someone who has a brain computer interface and might be the only way they can control a limb might be through FES, but right now we're seeing if we can get it implemented in a virtual situation. So the question that this generated in our previous work was, we were pretty early in the model development at this time, and the idea that it would work in real time was sort of overwhelming to me. We have collaborators, again, this is a link to the case group. We have collaborators in Cleveland, including Tom Vandenboger, who is a biomechanical modeling technical pioneer. He's made, and his collaboration with Bob Kirsch at Case and Ed Chadwick and Dimitra Blana demonstrated that they could do a real-time control of a shoulder and elbow movements, so that they could measure EMG in people and have an avatar where shoulder and elbow were moving in real time. And so we paired with them with this question, just would it even be feasible for this complex system with these small masses to be able to work in real time? And I'll tell you that I'll kind of skip over this because we're approaching the end, but the big issue was the numerical methods. Standard biomechanical modeling, we use explicit ODE solvers, and they are slow. They're especially slow because for the hand, the mass of the hand is very small. The mass and the inertias of the individual segments, if you're are minuscule, and simulations have to involve very stiff differential equations.
So, sorry, you're saying that the tendons are not compliant, relatively speaking, is that what that means?
There is compliance in the tendons, but they can, I think relative to all the other parameters, it's a non,
They seem stiff.
yeah. So we have one publication that was just implementing an implicit method to solve the differential equations. And the entire intent of this was just, is it even possible with 27 body segments, 23 degrees of freedom, 24 muscles, system dynamics with 94 variables? Is that possible to control in real time? And our conclusion was yes. Here, this is just their implementation of the implicit method solver versus the ODE 15S in MATLAB. And the conclusion was that we could get numerical stability up to a time step of 3.8 milliseconds with an error of 0.6 degrees. Yes.
Oh, yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, so I feel like humans can differ greatly in like, there's a big human deviation there. So I'm wondering for this model is based on some specific one's data, or it's like, is there any constraint to show that it actually reflects the ability of human beings?
So that was the idea of like the validation versus the grip strength. I think in general, we feel that our models that we have are reflective of the capability of a 50th percentile male. And then as Kevin brought up, if you wanted to apply that to a specific person, you might have to scale parameters up and down. You might have to make measurements in individual parameters. For somebody who has had an injury, there might be muscle adaptation or atrophy that you need to consider. And we study those kinds of questions in my lab. For the idea of implementing this in sort of a virtual world, that stuff becomes less important. And then I just wanted to show that we had this paper that was about, is it possible? And then my collaborators actually used the model in a real-time way as a proof of concept. So what I'm going to show you here is work that my collaborators did. What we see on the forearm here are sensors that are placed at positions where you can get good signal from individual muscles. And the electrical activity from the muscles is being fed into a real-time version of our model. And that is sending out the control signal to the robotic hand. So here's that video. So I was excited by it. So yeah, we've been working on it for a long time. In this project with Lee, one of the things we're doing is we're trying to get more data to describe how people use their arms and hands and perhaps improve the model. But one component is to study complex hand motions, get lots of EMG, measure some forces. That data will be used on the BCI part of the project to decode the brain signals to the EMG. And then on our side of the project, we're trying to get a model that goes from EMG to motion and force development. So at some point, the brain signals could be used to control a virtual arm. So I just wanted to show you that one of the things we've started doing is doing markerless motion capture in collaboration with James Cotton, a clinician scientist at the AbilityLab. We have this 8-camera setup in a lab at the AbilityLab where people can make complex hand motions, and we get 8 different views. We are embedding the kinematic model into the machine learning computer vision algorithm that decides where to put the markerless key points. So what I'm showing here is, this is video of somebody's going to be doing a American Sign Language D. They're sort of in this position and they're going to pronate and supinate while they're doing it. But what we're showing here is that some of the ways we've solved for where the markers, the key points and the markerless should be, but by informing it by the kinematic model that we've developed. So we put constraints on where the markers can go, so that it can only recreate motions that the model can recreate. So here's that video. So again, he's kind of like this, and he's doing a D, and he's rotating his hand back and forth. And this is using human pose estimation, and it's just constraining the solution based on knowing how the wrist and the index finger and the thumb can move as informed by the kinematics that we have in our model. And what's great about that is that because I was giving this talk, I have another student who's working on the simulations. This is work from Puyan Firozabadi in my lab. And I said, Puyan, can you send Max these kinematics and see if he can get a simulation running so I can have that for the end of my talk? And so I got emailed this yesterday and then I was like, can you change this? Can you change this? But what's great is like now we have this mapping between, we can get data in the lab. And it's the same joint angles that are used in our kinematic model. And so this is a solution where we said, track this motion exactly. And then you can't really see well, but there's muscles that are turning on red and blue. Solve for how to activate these muscles to create this motion. So the idea is then we can use the biomechanical simulation to say what muscles are needed to create this motion. And then ultimately, this model will be linked to the BCI signals. That's the dream. This has been a lot of work for a long time, and like I said, it's been sort of a 1 mile at a time, one water stop at a time sort of approach, and a lot of students and postdocs and just collaborators who even aren't on this page have contributed. So I hope you found this interesting. Thanks very much.
Take a couple questions.
Yes.
So in your simulation, you mentioned that numerical stiffness was a problem. How large of a system, how much of the upper extremity were you simulating in that case?
In that case. In this case, it was 27 body segments and 23 degrees of freedom. And so my guess is it was primarily the wrist and all of the index fingers, or all of the fingers and thumb. And so we've recently started adding back in the forearm rotation. This problem gets kind of dicey because if you're including the proximal arm, those masses are pretty normal. And then, so the differential is a problem. But we can do simulations, they just take a long time. And so this was kind of formulated in, even if you just had the hand and sort of basic wrist populate, could you do it?
I guess I was wondering if you're able to take advantage of like any sparsity in the structure, like you have a lot of muscles that are crossing over the wrist, but I could be wrong, but I don't think many of them cross over more joints, the extremity. So is there a way to like chunk up the equations that you're saying?
I think, you know, some of what this work was the sort of beginning of how do you solve this. This is gonna be a really naive statement. But I've been sort of interested because we ran into such problem with the numerics of the hand that this implicit solver has helped a lot with. But when we first ran into it, you know, it's just that with masses these small, mass and inertias this small. Yeah, this like,
Yeah.
you know, I've been thinking about like protein folding and things like that. There's dynamic simulations of other systems, and I've been sort of curious. And I think, you know, some of the work that Francisco does is more quasi-static, you know, how that maps into these sort of desire to do a forward simulation where you're taking measurements from someone's EMG and you're seeing motions that result, what that would involve. But I've been sort of interested in just these masses are very small. It's part of why the passive forces that I illustrated with the tenodesis are so important, because the inertias and the angular accelerations aren't coming from the inertia, I guess.
Yeah. Just like you could do a static problem.
Yeah.
How about like damping the muscle?
Damping is very, very important. There's less easy ways to measure that. And again, some of it is, and even, I didn't really tease this out as much as I meant to, but like when we talked about the elbow, you know, it's very easy to design an experiment to go, okay, there's 5 muscles that cross the elbow, and what are its moment arms, and what is the elbow's joint stiffness. It's much harder at the hand where there's multiple muscles crossing here, and there's 3 joints, and there's multiple muscles that actuate different versions of all three joints sort of thing. So those type of big parameters are very important. Without the right damping, you can't control this at all. But the question of, is the damping parameter we put in the model the appropriate one physically versus we need more damping because of the numerics is a good question.
Real quick. Why do we have all those little bones?
Yeah.
In our wrists? Like, why?
It's a good
Why would evolution
question.
have favored that?
It's a good question. We were talking about this because we were looking, I'm sorry, I forget your name, but we were looking at the ankle model and, I think that there must be something about load distribution that is helpful or just having that compliance, but I should, because I talk about it, I should look at what people are thinking, but I think it does. You know, we have an incredible amount of mobility and designing that is complicated, but I'm not sure what the theory is of why it's like this. But it's very clear that if you just take some of those bones out, your hand doesn't work as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, one of the things I found interesting is that in some of this work that we've been doing to validate stuff, you know, like we can't simulate the right endpoint forces at the thumb unless we have non-orthogonal, non-intersecting axes of rotation. I think there's stuff like that going on too, that this transformation is pretty complicated. And if you just replace that with, you know, a simple mechanical joint that does this and this, first you lose a lot of functionality, but I think there's also something about the transformation of the forces into the endpoint forces. But I guess there's no robotic version of that, right? Like,
Yeah, let's take Wendy one more time.